My father insists that I give my half-brother a job and a piece of the land I inherited from my grandfather, despite the fact that he abandoned me years ago. They even attempted to attack me, but it didn't end well for them. They all ended up on the floor. Growing up, my father and his siblings despised my grandfather, and for good reasons. Their father was an abusive alcoholic who made their lives and my grandmother's life miserable until her death. All of them left home as soon as they turned 18, never to return, except for my dad. None of them spoke to my grandfather again. My dad only saw him twice after leaving home. I first met my grandfather when I was 8 years old, at my mom's funeral. He approached me, knelt in front of me, and introduced himself, asking how I was doing. But before I could respond, my dad yanked me away, yelling as he dragged me off. I met him again at 11 when my dad dropped me off at his house and left me there. I later found out that my dad's new wife didn't want me around. You might think my dad was cruel for doing that, and I certainly did at the time, but it turned out to be the best thing he could have done for me, even though I hated him for it. My grandfather and I became very close. By then, his drinking days were far behind him, and he taught me everything: how to grow vegetables, farm, maintain the property, care for the land and animals, and even hunt. He also pushed me to get an education. My happiest moments were spent working the land with him. During our time together, he opened up about his life and the pain he caused his family. He never made excuses or tried to justify his behavior. He accepted responsibility for the hurt he caused. When I asked why he didn't try to reconcile with his children, he simply said they couldn't forget what he put them through, and he understood that. When I was 26, my grandfather passed away. I called my dad to inform him, but he didn't even recognize my voice at first. He told me to handle the funeral arrangements and hung up without asking how I was doing. I understood why he was distant, knowing what he had endured during his childhood, but it still hurt that he didn't care about my well-being. The resentment I already felt towards him only grew after the funeral. At the wake, a young woman introduced herself as my cousin. I knew my dad had siblings, but that was the extent of my knowledge. I had never met them or heard anything about them. So, I didn't contact any of them when my grandfather passed. I asked my cousin how she knew about his death, and she told me that my dad had called her mom. She stayed in town for a few days after the funeral, and we kept in touch, eventually becoming very close. A couple of years later, when she moved into town, I gave her an acre of land, where she, her husband, and their kids still live today. My grandfather left everything to me. None of my dad's siblings contested the will. My cousin told me her mom didn't want anything, not a single cent, from her father. I assumed the rest of the family felt the same because neither I nor my lawyer heard anything from them, until last week. My dad called me, saying his son needed a fresh start and wanted to move closer to help with my businesses. I run a few small businesses off my property, including a working farm where people can stay for a few days to experience farm life. I have all the help I need and don't need his. I told my dad I would think about it, but since then, he's been bombarding me with texts every day, suggesting roles for his son and telling me that family looks out for each other. He's even gone so far as to say that my grandfather owes him and has been telling me which part of the land I should give to his son and what would be best for when they visit. Whenever I see my dad's name pop up on my screen, I want to smash my phone. My anger and resentment are directed at him, not his son, but I still don't want him here. He's a stranger to me. Everything my grandfather left me is mine now, and I don't owe any of them anything. My cousin and her husband are on my side, saying that if it were up to them, they would tell my dad and his son to get lost since they've never made any effort to be family with me or even called to say hi. I know they're right. I reached out to a close friend who's a local cop and asked if he could confirm if my dad still lived at the same address. I also inquired about getting a trespass order, which turned out to be straightforward. I left the police station with the order in hand and my dad's address. I then asked another close friend to accompany me to my dad's house, as I believed that was where my half-brother lived. We drove there, about 10 hours, because I needed the time to gather my thoughts. We arrived unannounced and could hear a woman screaming inside from the curb. She wasn't screaming in distress, she was yelling at someone. My friend suggested I start recording on my phone, which I did. When my dad answered the door, he thought we were Jehovah's Witnesses and tried to slam the door in our faces. My friend stopped him, and when I said "Dad," he finally recognized me. His demeanor shifted from hostility to sudden opportunism. He invited us in, then hurried off. The yelling stopped, and he returned a minute later with his wife, who greeted us with a big smile and an unwelcome hug. The whole interaction made my skin crawl. We sat for a few minutes, exchanging small talk, before I asked where my brother was. My dad's wife called out for someone to get your brother, and I wasn't prepared to hear that there was more than one brother, or a sister. Sensing my discomfort, my friend began asking questions about my half-brother, what he did, whether he lived nearby, his work experience, and whether he had any experience with farm animals. My friend had a reason for asking these questions. He's familiar with farm work and knew the right things to ask. Eventually, two men walked in, clearly brothers. I didn't get good vibes from them at all. The younger one yelled for his sister to make him something to eat, while the older one sat down like he owned the place. He looked at my friend, then at me, and smirked. "So you're the one who's going to set me up," he said, as if it were already decided. I looked at my friend, who replied that he wasn't taking him on. After a few seconds of silence, my dad's wife asked what we meant. I explained that I had no positions available and wasn't hiring, but my friend had been looking for farmhands, until now. She then asked about the land, and my friend said the job had come with a 2-bedroom cottage at reduced rent, but it was no longer available. That's when everything exploded. They accused me of being stuck up, of thinking I was better than them, of owing them something. They even suggested I had been my grandfather's lover before he died. My dad's wife tried to attack me, but I held my arm up, caught her face in my hand, and shoved her back. She flipped over the couch. My dad then tried to attack me, but my friend intervened and knocked him to the floor. My half-brother tried to defend his dad and got a punch to the jaw for his trouble, ending up on the floor as well. I pulled out the trespass order, dropped it beside my dad, and told them what it was. Then we left. On our way out, we saw the other brother standing there in shock, but I barely registered him. I was too focused on my sister, who was beautiful but had scratches on her face and a swollen lip. Our plan was to drive straight home, but I couldn't leave, and my friend wouldn't leave me there alone. We got a hotel and spent 2 days watching my dad's house. Eventually, I saw my sister leave and followed her to a grocery store. I waited for her to come out and approached her slowly, like I would a nervous horse. She freaked out when she saw me, telling me to leave and that her brothers were discussing what they'd do to me if they got the chance. I told her I wasn't worried. I spoke to her calmly, hands at my sides, no sudden movements. I told her about my property, what we do there, and what we offer. I asked if she had a phone and gave her my number, telling her she could call or text me anytime, day or night. She texted me on our long drive home, asking if I had any dogs. It's been about a week since then. She texts me every day, several times a day, and last night she called me at 2 a.m. We talked for an hour about the dogs. Before hanging up, she told me she'd be 18 in May and wanted to ask if she could come live with me when she's legally able to leave her parents. If that's what she wants, I'll be there on her birthday to pick her up myself.